Eight months ago, Russia began its war of aggression against Ukraine. While Ukrainians resist and fight for the freedom of the nation, the consequences of the war extend well beyond the Eastern European country. The setbacks that sanctions inflict on the Russian economy and an unprecedented political marginalization at the global level have been isolating Moscow as never before, or at least as it did not happen since the years that followed the collapse of the Soviet state apparatus. To face such marginalization, Russia has made some strategic foreign policy choices. Among these, and we wrote about this months ago when the invasion had just kicked off, it was reasonable to expect that Russia would have strengthened its relations with countries of the Middle East, Northern Africa, and also Central Africa, where it has massive military and economic interests. In fact, Russia's scramble for the Middle East and North Africa is not new. These are macro regions in which Putin's Russia has been investing for quite a long time. Probably, this should not come as a surprise. Leaving aside Russia's historical engagement in the area, which will bring us back to the time of the so-called Cold War, in recent times, the event that marked Russia's engagement with the Middle East was the launch of its Syrian campaign in 2015. Operations in Libya have started almost simultaneously, and gradually they granted Moscow a stable military presence in Northern Africa. You will then remember the Russia-Africa Summit of 2019, hosted in Sochi, that seemed to mark the country's commitment to a long-lasting engagement in continental Africa. But what does this presence look like today? The importance of Russia's involvement in conflicts of the MENA is evident in the magnitude of its military deployments and in the extent to which this can influence equilibriums on the ground. Data are not easy to find. As per the latest available ones, released by the Russian Ministry of Defense, around 48,000 officials' military personnel have been deployed in Syria between 2015 and 2018, alongside 7,000 private contractors. In Libya, an estimated 5,000 mercenaries have been operating in support of Tobruk's forces on behalf of the Wagner Group, the private military company with close ties to the Kremlin. Libya, and increasingly Sudan, where the establishment of a Russian naval base in Port Sudan is under negotiations, play the role of real hubs for Moscow's scramble for the African continent. In Mali, an estimated 1,000 Russian mercenaries and 400 military advisors have been deployed. In the Central African Republic, 1,400 mercenaries and 600 military instructors are present. Over the past few weeks, Russia seems to have deepened its engagement in Burkina Faso as well, where during the recent coup d'etat, civilians and troops took the street with Russian flags and asked for a security partnership to Moscow. All these missions, as Russians call them, and especially the deployment of private contractors, have definitely shaped the security landscape of these territories, while also giving Moscow a foothold in these regions. This has not changed since the start of the war in Ukraine, but Russia has slightly revised its strategy. On one side, it has withdrawn many mercenaries from this country, especially from Libya, and replaced them to Ukraine. Libyan officials have confirmed that such relocation was taking place already in April 2022, less than 2 months into the war, but provided no figures. Some estimate that at least 1,200 mercenaries have been removed from Libya, but it could be more. On the other side, Moscow increased its diplomatic engagement with these countries, with Minister Lavrov and President Putin traveling to the region and hosting Middle Eastern and North African leaders to Moscow on several occasions. For instance, Lavrov had meetings with leaders of the GCC states, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and sought a coordination with them on oil production, so to regulate prices raised because of the war. Russian-Egyptian cooperation has also grown. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry flew to Moscow 2 times for political consultations. And such consultations have secured Egypt its first ever nuclear power plant. Rosatom, the Russian energy state atomic corporation, has begun construction of the El Dabaa project in July. This is a $25 billion project, the largest venture between Russia and Egypt in decades, which, in the words of the Egyptian authorities, will allow the country to reach new levels of technological development. Or yet, in July, Putin traveled to Iran, where he met Iranian and Turkish counterparts. Although the official reason for the visit was a meeting of the Astana-Syria talks, clearly much more was discussed, including the provision of Iranian drones to Moscow. These are munitions that are proving quite important and especially useful to the Russians to destroy Ukrainian electric infrastructures. In fact, growing cooperation with Iran is probably the most significant achievement of Moscow's renewed diplomatic activism in the Middle East. Very recently, the Islamic Republic claimed that it is ready to provide Russia with missiles as well, and just yesterday to supply it with 40 turbines to help its gas industry and amid Western sanctions. So Russians have been reinforcing their activism in the Middle East, Northern Africa and Africa to secure dialogue with political and economic allies, and also to seek alternative partnerships amid international Western isolation. And they found quite an extent of availability from these countries. It will be therefore increasingly important to monitor and understand these developments.